A black boy named Liam runs to the hospital, clutching a crying white baby in his arms. The moment he arrives, Dr. Brooks, an elderly physician, falls to her knees and breaks down in tears. Why was the baby alone, and what connects the doctor so deeply to Liam's actions? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Liam's sneakers crunched against the fallen autumn leaves as he made his way home from school. The afternoon sun warmed his face, and a gentle breeze ruffled his short, dark curls. His backpack felt heavy with homework, but his mind felt even heavier with thoughts about his day. The familiar path through Henderson Park stretched out before him, empty and peaceful compared to the noisy hallways of Washington Elementary. Here, away from the chattering students and squeaking classroom chairs, Liam could finally hear himself think. "Mom's probably at work right now," he whispered to himself, kicking a small stone along the path. He pictured her in her nurse's scrubs, rushing between hospital rooms with that tired but determined smile she always wore. Sometimes she worked double shifts just to make sure they had everything they needed. The usually bustling playground stood silent. No kids on the swings, no basketballs bouncing on the court. Just the whisper of leaves dancing in the wind and distant traffic sounds. Liam didn't mind the quiet. It matched his thoughtful mood. "If only I could help more," he murmured, passing the empty benches where elderly couples usually sat feeding pigeons. His mom always told him that doing well in school was the best way he could help, but it didn't feel like enough. He dreamed of doing something bigger, something that would make her life easier. Walking past the dried-up fountain, Liam remembered how his mom would sometimes skip her coffee in the morning to make sure he had lunch money. The memory made his chest feel tight. In his daydreams, he imagined surprising her with a spotless house, or somehow earning enough money to buy her those comfortable shoes she'd been eyeing at the mall. The park's unusual emptiness made each of his footsteps echo slightly. Normally, younger kids would be climbing on the jungle gym, and teenagers would be shooting hoops. Today, it felt like he had the whole park to himself. The solitude wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, giving him space to think. He paused near the old oak tree, watching a single red leaf spiral down from its branches. His teacher, Mrs. Winston, had asked the class today what they wanted to be when they grew up. While other kids shouted out astronaut and YouTube star, Liam had stayed quiet, thinking about how he just wanted to make enough money to let his mom work only one job instead of two. The metal loops of his backpack dug into his shoulders as he adjusted the weight, reminding him of the math homework inside. His mom always said education was the key to a better future, and he believed her. Still, sometimes he wished he could fast-forward time just to get to the part where he could really help. A faint cry pierced through the quiet park, pulling Liam from his daydreams. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, but there it was again. A weak, distressed wail that made his heart skip a beat. He stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The crying grew louder as he moved toward the playground. There, partially hidden behind a bush near the swing sets, sat a stroller. Liam's eyes widened as he approached, his footsteps quickening with each step. Inside the stroller, a small baby with rosy cheeks was crying, tiny fists waving in the air. The infant was wrapped in a thin, worn blanket that had seen better days. "Hello?" Liam called out, his voice echoing across the empty park. "Is anyone here?" He spun around, scanning every direction, but saw no one. No parent, no babysitter, not a single person in sight. The baby's cries grew more urgent. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the distressed infant. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, with wispy blonde hair and tear-stained cheeks. Something about seeing such a tiny, helpless baby left all alone made Liam's chest tighten with worry. "It's okay," he whispered softly to the crying infant. "Don't worry, I'll get you help." He remembered his mom talking about abandoned babies being brought to the hospital sometimes. The hospital, that's where he needed to go. His mom worked there, and even if she wasn't on shift, there would be other nurses and doctors who could help. It was only a few blocks away. Liam glanced around one final time, hoping to see someone running back to claim the baby, but the park remained deserted. The infant's cries had turned into quiet whimpers, those tiny eyes looking up at him with complete trust. Taking a deep breath, Liam grabbed the handles of the stroller. He knew what he had to do. "We're going to get you somewhere safe," he said firmly, his voice steadier than he felt as he began pushing the stroller toward the hospital. The baby cooed softly in response, as if understanding his words. Liam's hands gripped the stroller handles tightly as he started down the sidewalk. His heart was racing, but he tried to keep his steps steady and smooth so he wouldn't upset the baby. The responsibility of keeping this tiny human safe felt huge, bigger than anything he'd ever done before. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, more to himself than to the infant. "The hospital's not too far." As he pushed the stroller along the busy street, he noticed how people in passing cars would slow down, their faces pressed against windows to stare. Some drivers even craned their necks for a second look. A young black boy pushing a white baby in a worn-out stroller. Liam could feel their eyes on him, making his cheeks burn and his stomach twist into knots. An SUV drove by especially slowly, the woman behind the wheel frowning deeply at him. Liam's shoulders tensed, but he kept moving forward. He knew what this might look like to others, but the baby's needs were more important than his discomfort. The infant started to fuss again, perhaps sensing Liam's anxiety. "Shh," he whispered softly, trying to sound as gentle as his mother did when she calmed crying babies at work. "We're almost there. You're being so brave." At the crosswalk, Liam waited for the light to change, gently rocking the stroller back and forth. More cars slowed down, more faces turned to watch. A police car drove past, and Liam's heart jumped into his throat, but it continued on its way. He took a deep breath, remembering what his mother always said. "Do what's right, even when it's hard." The baby's whimpers grew louder, echoing off the buildings around them. Liam leaned down closer to the stroller, speaking in a soft, steady voice. "Hey there, little one. Want to hear a song? My mom used to sing this to me." He began humming quietly, a lullaby his mother had sung to him countless times when he was smaller. The infant's cries gradually settled into quiet coos. As they made their way through the busy streets, Liam kept his focus on the baby and the path ahead, trying his best to ignore the stares and whispers from passers-by. He knew the hospital was getting closer with each step, and that thought gave him courage. The weight of what he was doing, helping this abandoned infant, made him feel both scared and proud at the same time. "Just a few more blocks," he said softly to the baby, who was now watching him with wide, trusting eyes. "We're going to get you all the help you need." The automatic doors of the hospital slid open with a gentle whoosh as Liam pushed the stroller into the bright, sterile lobby. The cool air conditioning hit his face, and he realized how much he'd been sweating from the walk. The baby had fallen into a light sleep, making tiny sounds with each breath. The busy hospital lobby suddenly grew quieter. Heads turned, and conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman clutching her purse pulled it closer to her body. An elderly man's eyes widened as he lowered his newspaper. The receptionist behind the front desk stood up, her mouth slightly open. Liam's throat felt dry. His hands trembled on the stroller handles, but he kept moving forward toward the front desk. The clicking of his sneakers against the polished floor seemed impossibly loud in the hushed space. Two nurses in blue scrubs rushed over, their faces tight with concern. A doctor in a white coat followed close behind them. "What's going on here?" one of the nurses asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Liam's words tumbled out quickly. "I found this baby all alone in Henderson Park. There was nobody around. No mom, no dad. Nobody watching them. The baby was crying, and I didn't know what else to do." His voice cracked a little. "I couldn't just leave them there." The second nurse bent down to check on the infant while the doctor studied Liam's face intently. Liam could see the questions in their eyes, the assumptions they were making. "I promise I'm telling the truth," Liam said, his voice smaller now but still determined. "The baby was just sitting there in the stroller all alone. I know what you might think, but I just wanted to help." The baby stirred and started to whimper. Without thinking, Liam reached down to gently rock the stroller, the same way he'd been doing during their whole journey. The infant settled almost immediately, making the nurses exchange surprised glances. "The park is almost 20 blocks from here," the doctor said, his expression softening slightly. "Did you walk all that way?" Liam nodded, suddenly aware of how tired his legs felt. "Yes, sir. I knew the hospital would know what to do." Just then, an older woman in a pristine white coat emerged from around the corner, her silver hair neatly pulled back in a bun. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Margaret Brooks. She had been walking with measured steps, reviewing a patient's chart, but the unusual silence in the lobby drew her attention. She looked up, her professional curiosity evident in her raised eyebrows. As she made her way closer to the small gathering, her eyes fell on the sleeping infant in the stroller. The chart slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor with a sharp snap that echoed through the quiet lobby. "Emma?" Dr. Brooks whispered, her usually steady voice trembling. "Emma?" she repeated, louder this time, rushing forward with unsteady steps. The composed doctor's transformation was immediate and striking. Her face crumpled as tears welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Her hands shook as she reached for the baby, checking every inch of the sleeping infant's face. This is my granddaughter," she choked out between sobs. "She disappeared from our backyard this afternoon. My daughter-in-law was hanging laundry, and when she turned around..." Her voice broke completely. Dr. Brooks's legs gave way and she sank to her knees beside the stroller. Her shoulders shook with heavy sobs as she gently stroked the baby's tiny hand. The other medical staff stood frozen, watching their usually composed colleague break down. "I've been so scared," she whispered, looking up at Liam through tear-filled eyes. "We've been searching everywhere, the police, everyone. How did you..." Liam shifted nervously on his feet, overwhelmed by the doctor's intense emotional response. The same nurses who had looked at him with suspicion moments ago now stared at him with dawning understanding and shame. "I found her in Henderson Park, ma'am," Liam explained softly. "She was all alone in the stroller. I couldn't just leave her there, so I brought her here." Dr. Brooks reached out and grabbed Liam's hand, squeezing it tightly. Her tears fell faster as she looked at the young boy who had saved her granddaughter. "You walked all this way," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought her here all by yourself. You saved her. You saved my Emma." The hospital staff watched in stunned silence as the respected Dr. Brooks knelt on the floor, clutching the hand of a young black boy she'd never met before, crying tears of joy and gratitude over her sleeping granddaughter. Dr. Brooks gently lifted Emma from the stroller, her hands shaking as she cradled the infant against her chest. The baby stirred slightly but remained peacefully asleep, her tiny fingers curling around the collar of her grandmother's white coat. "Thank you," Dr. Brooks whispered, her voice catching. "Thank you so much." She kept repeating the words, each time with more emotion than the last, as tears continued to stream down her face. Her professional demeanor had completely dissolved, replaced by the raw relief of a grandmother whose worst fears had just been erased. Liam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his school shirt. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. The way Dr. Brooks looked at him, like he was some kind of hero, made his cheeks burn with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "It's okay," he mumbled, looking down at his scuffed sneakers. "I just wanted to help." The words came out soft and uncertain, nearly lost in the quiet of the lobby. Dr. Brooks reached out with one hand and touched Liam's shoulder, causing him to look up at her tear-stained face. "You did more than help," she said, her voice trembling but warm. "You brought my family back together. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough." The intensity of her gratitude made Liam's stomach flutter with a strange mix of emotions. He felt proud that he'd done the right thing, but the attention made him want to disappear into the floor. The same nurses who had looked at him with suspicion earlier were now smiling at him with admiration, which only added to his discomfort. "I'm just glad she's safe," Liam managed to say, offering a small smile. He watched as Dr. Brooks pressed a gentle kiss to Emma's forehead, her tears falling softly onto the baby's blanket. The sight made his heart feel full, even as he struggled with the overwhelming attention he was receiving. Dr. Brooks took a deep, shaky breath, trying to collect herself as she held Emma close. The initial burst of emotion began to settle, though her eyes remained glossy with tears. A nurse stepped forward, her clipboard held tight against her chest, and cleared her throat. "We need to document this," she said, her tone professional but carrying an edge of suspicion. "Could you tell us exactly how you found the baby?" Liam felt the weight of everyone's stares as he stood in the bright hospital lobby. The fluorescent light seemed to grow harsher, making him even more aware of how out of place he felt. "I was walking home from school," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "through Henderson Park. You know, the one with the big playground?" He glanced around, seeing the staff nod in recognition. A security guard moved closer, his arms crossed. "And you just happened to find the baby there?" The question carried a hint of doubt that made Liam's stomach twist. "I heard crying," Liam continued, trying to keep his voice from trembling. It was really quiet in the park, which was weird because usually there are lots of people there after school. But the crying… He paused, remembering the moment. It sounded scared and lonely. Another nurse stepped forward, her pen hovering over a form. "Did you see anyone else in the park? Anyone running away, maybe?" Liam shook his head. "No, ma'am. I looked around, but there was nobody. Just the stroller with the baby." His hands fidgeted with his backpack straps. "I couldn't just leave her there." "And you didn't think to call the police?" a different staff member asked, his eyebrows raised. Liam felt his face grow hot. "I don't have a phone. My mom says I'm not old enough yet, and the hospital was close, so I thought…" He trailed off, suddenly unsure if he'd done the right thing after all. Dr. Brooks, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "The hospital was the right choice," she said firmly, though her voice was still thick with emotion. "Emma needed medical attention right away." The questioning continued, each new inquiry making Liam feel smaller. They asked about the exact location of the stroller, the time he found the baby, what direction he came from. Though their words were polite, their tones and expressions suggested they weren't entirely convinced by his story. "Are you absolutely sure you're telling us everything?" the security guard pressed, leaning in slightly. Liam felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to help, that's all." The staff exchanged glances, their faces a mix of uncertainty and concern. Even as they wrote down his answers, their body language spoke of lingering doubts, making Liam wish he could somehow prove that he was telling the truth. The automatic doors of the hospital lobby slid open with a soft hiss, and 2 police officers strode in. Their badges gleamed under the bright lights as they approached the group gathered around Liam. The taller officer, with graying hair at his temples, took out a small notebook while his younger partner positioned himself closer to Liam. "I'm Officer Martinez, and this is Officer Collins," the younger officer announced, his voice carrying an authority that made Liam's shoulders tense. "We received a call about a missing infant being brought in." Liam swallowed hard, his throat suddenly feeling dry. The officers towered over him, their expressions stern and calculating. "Son, we need you to tell us exactly what happened," Officer Collins said, his pen poised over his notebook. "And I mean everything. No detail is too small." "I already told everyone," Liam said softly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I found the baby in Henderson Park." Officer Martinez's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't see anyone else? No one running away? No suspicious vehicles?" "No, sir," Liam replied, his voice growing smaller with each question. "Were you alone in the park?" Officer Collins pressed. "Any friends with you?" "No, sir, just me." Dr. Brooks stepped forward, still cradling Emma. "Officers, this young man brought my granddaughter to safety. He walked all the way here with her stroller." "Ma'am," Officer Martinez interrupted gently but firmly, "we need to investigate this thoroughly. A baby doesn't just disappear and reappear without explanation." The officers continued their questioning, their tone growing more intense with each response. They asked about Liam's route home, his normal routine, whether he'd ever seen anything suspicious in the park before. "And you didn't think to ask anyone for help along the way?" Officer Collins asked, his pen scratching against the paper. There must have been adults around. People just stared, Liam admitted, looking down at his feet. I thought the hospital would be safest. Officers, Dr. Brooks interjected again, her voice stronger this time. This child showed incredible courage. He could have walked away, but instead, he brought Emma to where he knew she'd be safe. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly at Dr. Brooks's words, but the suspicion didn't completely leave their eyes. We still need to take a full statement, Officer Martinez said, his hand resting on his belt. And we'll need to contact your parents, young man. Liam's heart raced faster at the mention of his mother. He hadn't even thought about how late he was getting home, or how worried she must be. The questioning continued, each new inquiry making Liam feel more like a suspect than a helper. Despite Dr. Brooks's occasional attempts to defend him, the officers maintained their professional distance and skepticism, treating every answer with careful consideration and noting down each detail in their notebooks. The officers' questions continued, each one feeling heavier than the last. Liam's stomach churned as he noticed how Officer Collins kept glancing at his partner with raised eyebrows after each of Liam's answers. And you're absolutely certain you didn't see anyone else in the park? Officer Martinez asked for what felt like the 10th time. Liam's eyes burned with unshed tears. No, sir, I already told you. It just seems unusual, Officer Collins cut in, that a baby would be left completely alone. Dr. Brooks, still holding Emma close, opened her mouth to protest again, but before she could speak, a young nurse with auburn hair rushed forward from the gathering crowd. Wait, she exclaimed, her face lighting up with recognition. I think I saw something earlier today. I was jogging in Henderson Park during my lunch break. The officers turned their attention to her, and Liam felt a wave of relief as their scrutiny shifted away from him. There was a woman there, the nurse continued, twisting her hands together as she remembered. She was wearing a blue uniform, like a nanny's uniform. She was pushing a stroller that looks just like that one. She pointed to the empty stroller near Dr. Brooks. Officer Martinez's posture changed immediately. What time was this? Around noon, I think. She seemed really distressed, talking on her phone. I remember because she was walking back and forth looking really worried about something. Dr. Brooks gasped softly. That must have been Monica, Emma's nanny. She's been with us for years, but she wasn't answering her phone when we tried calling her. Was she acting strange lately? Officer Collins asked, his attention now fully focused on Dr. Brooks instead of Liam. No, but her mother hasn't been well. She's been worried about her, Dr. Brooks replied, her face softening with concern. Oh dear, I hope nothing's happened to her mother. The tension in the lobby seemed to dissolve as the officer's suspicion shifted away from Liam. Officer Martinez pulled out his phone, stepping aside to make a call, while Officer Collins started taking notes about the nanny's description. Liam felt his shoulders relax for the first time since the officers had arrived. He watched as they huddled together, discussing this new information in low voices, their earlier skepticism about him forgotten in light of this new lead. The officers huddled near the nurse's station, their voices low as they discussed the new information. Liam watched them from his spot near the wall, his heart still racing from the intense questioning. Though he was relieved that they'd found a possible explanation, the memory of their suspicious glances left a hollow feeling in his chest. Dr. Brooks approached him, still cradling Emma close. Her eyes were red from crying, but now they held a different kind of sadness as she looked at Liam. I'm so sorry about all of this, she said softly. You did something incredibly brave and kind today, and you didn't deserve to be treated with suspicion. Liam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure how to respond. It's okay, he mumbled, even though it wasn't really okay at all. No, it's not, Dr. Brooks insisted, reaching out to touch his shoulder gently. You saved my granddaughter. You're a hero, Liam. I can never thank you enough for what you did today. Her words were sincere and warm, but they couldn't completely erase the hurt Liam felt from the way everyone had initially reacted to him. He remembered the stares when he'd first walked in, the whispers, the immediate assumption that he must have done something wrong. I should probably go home now, Liam said quietly. "My mom will be wondering where I am." Dr. Brooks nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, but please let me call you a taxi. It's the least I can do." Liam politely declined, preferring to walk. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. As he headed toward the hospital exit, he could hear Dr. Brooks talking to the officers, her voice firm as she praised his actions once again. Walking through the automatic doors into the late afternoon sun, Liam felt a complicated mix of emotions. Pride swelled in his chest when he thought about helping the baby. He knew he'd done the right thing, but that pride was tangled up with a sharp ache, knowing that some people had looked at him and seen only threat instead of hero. He touched his chest where his heart still felt heavy. His mom had always taught him to help others, to do what was right, no matter what. Today, he had done exactly that, but the way people had treated him made him understand something his mom had tried to explain before. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't mean everyone would see it that way, at least not at first. Still, as he started his walk home, Liam held on to the memory of Emma's safe return to her grandmother. That moment, when Dr. Brooks had first seen her granddaughter, had been pure joy. Despite everything else, he had been part of making that happen, and no one could take that away from him. The next morning, Dr. Brooks sat at her desk in the hospital, staring at the phone. She had managed to get Liam's contact information from the police report, and now her fingers hovered over the keypad. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. After a few rings, a warm voice answered. "Hello? Hello? Is this Ms. Brown? Liam's mother?" "Yes, this is she." There was a note of concern in her voice. "This is Dr. Margaret Brooks from Central Hospital. I'm Emma's grandmother, the baby your son helped yesterday." Dr. Brooks' voice softened with emotion. "I wanted to personally thank you for raising such an incredible young man." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Oh," Ms. Brown said, her voice full of relief and pride. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Liam told me what happened yesterday. I'm just glad he could help." "He did more than help. He saved my granddaughter. I can't stop thinking about his courage and kindness." Dr. Brooks cleared her throat. "That's actually why I'm calling. I'd like to invite you and Liam to dinner at my home this Saturday. I want my family to meet the young hero who brought Emma back to us." Ms. Brown's breath caught slightly. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Are you sure your family would be comfortable with that?" Dr. Brooks felt her heart ache at the implied meaning behind those words. "Absolutely," she said firmly. "My family needs to meet the wonderful young man who helped us and his equally wonderful mother. Please say you'll come." Ms. Brown was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but worried. "It's just, after what happened at the hospital yesterday, with the way people treated Liam," she trailed off, not wanting to say more. "I understand your concerns," Dr. Brooks said gently. "What happened yesterday was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for it. That's part of why this dinner is so important to me. My family needs to see Liam as I do, as a brave, compassionate young man who didn't hesitate to help a stranger." Ms. Brown sighed. "Let me talk to Liam about it first. He was pretty upset yesterday when he came home." "Of course," Dr. Brooks replied. "Please let him know that Emma's parents are especially eager to meet him and thank him personally." "I'll discuss it with him tonight," Ms. Brown promised. "And Dr. Brooks, thank you for calling. It means a lot." As Dr. Brooks hung up the phone, she could hear the mixture of pride and apprehension in Ms. Brown's voice echoing in her mind. She understood the mother's hesitation all too well, especially after witnessing yesterday's events. But she was determined to make this dinner happen, to show her family, especially her son, that their preconceptions needed to change. Next Saturday, the evening air was crisp as Liam and his mother walked up the winding path to Dr. Brooks' house. Liam tugged nervously at his collar, feeling strange in the button-up shirt his mother had insisted he wear. The house loomed before them, its brick facade and tall windows making their own apartment building seem tiny in comparison. "It's so big," Liam whispered to his mother, who squeezed his hand reassuringly. Before they could ring the doorbell, Dr. Brooks opened the door with a warm smile that lit up her entire face. "You came. I'm so happy to see you both." She was wearing a casual but elegant sweater that somehow made Liam feel even more out of place. "Thank you for having us," Liam's mother said softly, holding the bouquet of flowers they'd brought. "Oh, these are lovely," Dr. Brooks exclaimed, taking the flowers. "Please, come in, come in." Liam's eyes widened as they stepped into the entrance hall. Everything seemed to shine, from the polished wooden floors to the crystal chandelier hanging above them. Family photos lined the walls, showing happy moments frozen in time. "This way," Dr. Brooks guided them toward the living room. "Everyone's excited to meet you both." Liam's stomach did a little flip as they entered the spacious room. A man in his 30s stood up from an armchair, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Brooks gestured toward him. "This is my son, James, Emma's father." James nodded politely, extending his hand first to Liam's mother. "Thank you for coming." His voice was steady but distant, like someone talking to strangers at a business meeting. When he shook Liam's hand, his grip was loose and his eyes didn't quite meet Liam's. "And this is my daughter-in-law, Sarah," Dr. Brooks continued, as a young woman approached them with baby Emma in her arms. Sarah's smile seemed more genuine than her husband's, though Liam could sense her uncertainty. "It's wonderful to meet you both," Sarah said, bouncing Emma gently. "We can't thank you enough for what you did, Liam." Liam shuffled his feet, very aware of James watching him. The room felt too big, too fancy, and too quiet. Even the soft classical music playing in the background made him feel like he didn't belong. He wished he could disappear into one of the plush couches or hide behind the enormous potted plants in the corners. Dr. Brooks seemed to notice the tension. She placed a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder. "Would you like to see Emma up close? She's been much happier since her adventure in the park." Before Liam could answer, James cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all sit down first," he suggested, his tone polite but cool. "Dinner will be ready soon." Liam glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging smile despite the worry in her eyes. As they moved toward the seating area, Liam couldn't help but notice how James kept a careful distance between them, his posture stiff and formal. The dining room was even grander than the living room, with a long mahogany table that could easily seat 12 people. Crystal glasses sparkled under the warm light of another elaborate chandelier. Liam sat between his mother and Dr. Brooks, trying not to fidget in the high-backed chair. "So, Liam," James began, cutting into his roasted chicken with precise movements. "Which school do you attend?" "Washington Elementary, sir," Liam replied quietly, careful to use his best manners. "Ah," James nodded slowly. "That's in the east side of town, isn't it? Near the industrial district?" Liam's mother tensed slightly beside him. "Yes, it is. They have some wonderful teachers there." "And what does your father do?" James continued, his eyes fixed on Liam. Liam swallowed hard. "It's just me and my mom." "I see." James took a careful sip of water. "And you were in the park alone that day? No friends with you?" Dr. Brooks set down her fork. "James—" "I'm just trying to get the full picture, Mother," James interrupted smoothly. After all, it was quite fortunate that Liam happened to be there at exactly the right moment. Liam's stomach twisted uncomfortably. He could feel the doubt in James's voice, the careful way he emphasized certain words, as if trying to catch Liam in a lie. "I take that shortcut through the park most days after school," Liam explained, his voice growing smaller. "It's quieter than walking on the main streets." "And you regularly walk around unsupervised?" James raised an eyebrow. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "My son is very responsible," Liam's mother said firmly, though her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Of course," James replied smoothly. "It's just unusual these days to see children his age wandering alone, especially in that particular area." The weight of James's implications hung heavy in the air. Liam stared down at his plate, pushing a piece of broccoli around with his fork. He could feel James studying him, looking for something, some hint of dishonesty or ulterior motive that simply wasn't there. "I just wanted to help," Liam said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The baby was crying, and nobody else was around. How convenient, James murmured, just loud enough to be heard. Dr. Brooks shot her son a sharp look. James, that's enough. But the damage was done. Liam felt small and out of place, acutely aware of how different he was from this family in their big house with their fancy dishes. Every bite of food seemed to stick in his throat as James continued to watch him with that careful, measuring gaze. Liam's mother straightened in her chair, summoning a warm smile despite the tension. You know, Liam has always had such a caring heart, she began, her voice gentle but firm. Just last month, he spent his entire Saturday helping our elderly neighbor clean her yard after a storm. Dr. Brooks seized the opportunity to shift the conversation. That doesn't surprise me at all. The way he handled finding Sarah showed such maturity and compassion. James made a non-committal sound, taking another measured sip of water. He's always been that way, Liam's mother continued, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. When he was 7, he gave his birthday money to a classmate who couldn't afford new shoes. Liam felt his cheeks grow warm at the praise, but his mother's touch helped steady him. He risked a glance at James, who was methodically cutting his meat into precise squares, his expression carefully neutral. What remarkable generosity, Dr. Brooks added, beaming at Liam. You know, I've been telling my colleagues at the hospital about your quick thinking. Not many adults would have handled the situation as well as you did. Or perhaps some adults would have handled it differently, James interjected smoothly. Called the police first, for instance, rather than taking matters into their own hands. Dr. Brooks set down her fork with a sharp clink. The baby needed immediate medical attention, James. Liam made exactly the right choice bringing her to the hospital. The air grew thick with unspoken words. Liam's mother's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, and he could feel her tension even as she maintained her composure. Well, she said brightly, though her voice wavered slightly, Liam has always had good instincts about helping others. His teachers often comment on how he looks out for younger students at school. But James's subtle disapproval seemed to seep into every corner of the elegant dining room, making even Dr. Brooks's warm praise feel somehow diminished. Each attempt at pleasant conversation was met with a raised eyebrow or a carefully worded question that carried hidden barbs. Dr. Brooks tried again, describing how the hospital staff had been impressed by Liam's calm demeanor during the crisis. Yet even as she spoke, James's skeptical glances and measured silence continued to undermine her words, creating an uncomfortable undercurrent that made both Liam and his mother shift uneasily in their chairs. The evening wore on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Liam pushed his food around his plate, his appetite diminishing with every subtle jab from James. His mother maintained her gentle smile, though Liam could see the strain around her eyes as she continued to share positive stories about their community and family life. We're so blessed to have such wonderful neighbors, his mother said warmly, carefully cutting her chicken. When I had to work late shifts last year, they would check in on Liam, bring over casseroles. How often do you work late shifts? James interrupted, his tone carrying a hint of judgment. Liam felt his chest tighten as he watched his mother's smile falter slightly. I try to balance my schedule, she replied evenly. Liam is very responsible for his age. James murmured, the sound somehow making Liam feel smaller in his chair. And his father? James. Dr. Brooks cut in sharply, but the damage was done. Liam's mother straightened her shoulders, her voice remaining steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. I've raised Liam on my own since he was 2. He's grown into a wonderful young man. Of course he has, Dr. Brooks said quickly, trying to smooth over the moment. Just look at how he helped Sarah. Yes, James drawled. Quite interesting how he happened to be there at just the right moment. The implication hung heavy in the air. Liam felt tears prick at his eyes, but he blinked them back, remembering his mother's words about staying strong in difficult moments. He could feel her pain radiating beside him, even as she continued to engage politely in conversation. The park is on my way home from school, Liam said quietly, his voice smaller than he intended. I always take that path. His mother reached under the table and squeezed his hand. her touch both comforting and protective. They exchanged a brief glance, years of facing prejudice together reflected in their shared look. Though they both smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, each veiled criticism and doubtful glance chipped away at their spirits. The weight of proving themselves worthy, of justifying their presence at this elegant table, pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. Despite Dr. Brooks's genuine warmth, her son's persistent skepticism had turned what should have been a celebration of Liam's heroism into an exercise in endurance. Liam set down his fork, his heart pounding against his chest. The constant questions and doubtful looks had finally become too much to bear. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at James, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "I was walking home from school," he began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I heard crying in the park. Not just regular crying, the kind that makes you worry." He paused, remembering that moment. "The baby, Sarah, she was all alone. No one was around. I looked everywhere, sir. I really did." The table fell silent. Even James stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "I kept thinking about what my mom always tells me," Liam continued, his voice growing clearer. "She says we have to look out for each other, that helping people is what makes us human. I couldn't just leave a baby alone. I wouldn't leave any baby alone, no matter what they looked like or who they were." Tears welled up in Dr. Brooks's eyes as she listened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Liam's. "Of course you wouldn't, sweetheart. You did exactly the right thing." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expression hard to read. "Well, it was fortunate you were there," he said stiffly, though his tone hadn't softened much. Liam felt a familiar ache in his chest, one he'd felt too many times before. He looked at James, seeing the same look he'd seen on countless other faces: doubt, suspicion, an unwillingness to believe in his good intentions simply because of who he was. Despite Dr. Brooks' warmth and gratitude, despite saving Sarah, despite everything he'd done right, it still wasn't enough to change some people's minds. "I just wanted to help," Liam said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "That's all I ever wanted to do." Dr. Brooks squeezed his hand tighter, her voice thick with emotion. "And you did help, Liam. You did something extraordinary, something brave and kind. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." But as Liam glanced at James, who had returned to his meal with a slight frown, he couldn't help but wonder if there would always be people who would look at him and see only what they wanted to see, never what was truly in his heart. The dinner drew to a close, the clinking of silverware against plates echoing in the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the dining room. Liam pushed the remains of his dessert around his plate, his appetite long gone. His mother sat beside him, her back straight but her hands fidgeting with her napkin, a sure sign she was upset. Dr. Brooks rose from her chair, her eyes filled with sadness as she watched James excuse himself without a proper goodbye. She walked around the table to where Liam and his mother sat, placing a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't at all what I wanted for tonight. Your son is a hero, Mrs. Brown, and I'm deeply ashamed of how my family has made you both feel." Liam's mother managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You've been very kind to us, Dr. Brooks. We appreciate the invitation." "No," Dr. Brooks shook her head firmly. "Your kindness, both of yours, deserves so much more than this. What Liam did for Sarah." Her voice caught for a moment. "I'll never be able to thank you enough. Please let me make this up to you somehow." Liam looked up at Dr. Brooks, seeing the genuine distress in her eyes. He wanted to tell her it was okay that they were used to this kind of treatment, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded, his eyes dropping back to his plate. As they gathered their things to leave, Dr. Brooks hugged them both, holding on a little longer than usual. "I promise you," she said softly, "this isn't the end of things. You're both very special people, and I won't forget what you've done for my family." But as Liam and his mother stepped out into the cool evening air, they shared a knowing look. Despite Dr. Brooks's kind words and promises, They felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settling over them. They'd been here before, caught between someone's gratitude and another's prejudice, never quite sure where they truly stood. The walk to their car was quiet, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Behind them, the grand house loomed like a reminder of the distance between their worlds, a distance that even an act of pure kindness couldn't seem to bridge. After a few days, the storm came without warning, a violent typhoon that turned the peaceful town into chaos within hours. Rain hammered against windows and wind howled through streets, transforming them into rushing rivers. Liam pressed his face against the cold glass of their living room window, watching as debris floated past their house. "Get away from there, baby," his mother called, her voice tight with worry. She was rushing around their small home trying to stuff important documents and photos into plastic bags as water began seeping under their door. The walls creaked ominously, and suddenly there was a terrible cracking sound from above. Liam's mother grabbed his arm and pulled him away just as part of the ceiling collapsed, water pouring in like a waterfall. "We have to go now," she shouted over the storm's roar, grabbing their emergency backpack. They splashed through their flooded living room, the water already up to Liam's knees. His mother held his hand tightly as they pushed through their front door into the tempest outside. Their neighborhood had become unrecognizable. Houses groaned under the assault of wind and rain, while cars bobbed like toys in the rising water. Neighbors were wading through the flood, carrying what little they could save. Mrs. Jenkins from next door was clutching her cat to her chest, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "The community center," someone shouted through the storm. "They're taking people in at the community center." Liam and his mother joined the stream of displaced families heading toward higher ground. The wind whipped at their clothes, and Liam could barely see through the sheets of rain. His shoes were completely underwater now, and each step was a struggle against the current. "Hold on to me tight," his mother kept saying, her grip on his hand almost painful. "Don't let go, baby. Don't let go." When they finally reached the community center, they found it packed with other families. People sat huddled on the floor, many soaking wet and shivering. Children cried, and worried parents spoke in hushed voices about homes and possessions lost to the flood. A volunteer handed them each a scratchy blanket and directed them to a corner where they could sit. Liam watched as his mother tried to wring out her clothes, her hands shaking. He knew she was trying to be strong for him, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "Mom," he whispered, wrapping his blanket around her shoulders instead of himself. "It's okay. We're together." She pulled him close, and they huddled together on the hard floor, listening to the storm rage outside. Their home, the place where they'd made so many memories, was probably destroyed. All their belongings, the photos on the walls, his mother's precious collection of books, all of it might be gone. Around them, other families were in similar states of shock and grief. An elderly couple held each other, whispering prayers. A young mother tried to soothe her crying baby while her other children slept fitfully beside her. The air was thick with worry and uncertainty about what would happen next. Liam felt his mother's arms tighten around him as another crack of thunder shook the building. They had each other, but for the first time in his life, he didn't know where they would sleep tonight or what tomorrow would bring. Dr. Brooks heard about the devastation in Liam's neighborhood through the hospital grapevine. That evening, she sat in her study, staring at her phone, her heart heavy with concern. The memory of Liam's kindness in saving her granddaughter filled her with determination. Without hesitation, she dialed the number she had kept from their dinner. "Hello?" Liam's mother's voice sounded exhausted on the other end. "This is Dr. Brooks," she said softly. "I heard about what happened in your neighborhood. Are you and Liam safe?" "We're at the community center," his mother replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Our house, there's significant damage." Dr. Brooks took a deep breath. "Please, let me help. I have plenty of room in my home. You and Liam can stay here until you get back on your feet." There was a long pause on the other end. Dr. Brooks could hear the chaos of the shelter in the background, crying children, worried voices, the echo of footsteps on the hard floor. "That's very kind," Liam's mother said carefully, "but we couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Dr. Brooks insisted. "Please, your son saved my granddaughter. Let me do this for you both." In the community center, Liam watched his mother's face as she spoke on the phone. Her expression shifted from uncertainty to relief, though worry still creased her forehead. When she hung up, she turned to him. "Dr. Brooks offered to let us stay with her until we can figure things out," she explained, studying his reaction. Liam's stomach twisted with mixed emotions. He remembered the uncomfortable dinner, the suspicious glances from Dr. Brooks's son, but he also remembered Dr. Brooks's kindness, her genuine gratitude. Maybe this could be different. "What do you think, baby?" his mother asked, running her fingers through his damp hair. Liam looked around at the crowded community center, at the families huddled together on thin mats. He thought about their waterlogged home, about his mother's exhaustion. "Maybe we should try," he said quietly. "Dr. Brooks is nice." His mother nodded, pulling him close. "She is, and it would only be temporary, just until we can get back on our feet." An hour later, Dr. Brooks arrived at the community center herself, despite the dangerous weather. She helped them load their few salvaged belongings into her car, her movements gentle and concerned. As they drove through the flooded streets, she spoke softly about the room she had prepared for them, trying to make them feel welcome. Liam sat in the back seat watching the raindrops race down the window. His heart felt lighter than it had all day, but nervousness still fluttered in his chest. He hoped this time would be different. He hoped Dr. Brooks's family would see him differently now. Most of all, he hoped this chance might help bridge the gap between their two worlds. Dr. Brooks led Liam and his mother up the grand staircase to the guest room. The space was bigger than their entire living room back home, with soft beige walls and a large window overlooking the garden. 2 queen-sized beds sat against opposite walls, topped with fluffy white comforters that looked like clouds. "I hope this will be comfortable for you both," Dr. Brooks said warmly, showing them the attached bathroom with its gleaming marble countertops. Liam's mother clutched her small bag of salvaged belongings, looking almost lost in the luxurious surroundings. "This is too much, Dr. Brooks. We can't thank you enough." That first night, Liam lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the rain against the window. Everything felt strange. The softness of the mattress, the quiet of the house. Even the air smelled different, like lavender and vanilla instead of his mother's cooking. The next morning, Liam woke early and found his mother already up, straightening the bedding with hospital corners just like she did at work. She caught his eye and smiled softly. "We need to show Dr. Brooks how grateful we are," she whispered. "Maybe we can help around the house." Liam nodded eagerly. Together, they went downstairs and found the kitchen. His mother started a pot of coffee, while Liam carefully wiped down the counters. When Dr. Brooks came down, surprise registered on her face at the sight of them working. "Oh, you didn't have to do this," she protested, but Liam's mother shook her head. "Please, let us help. It's the least we can do." Throughout the day, they found ways to make themselves useful. Liam noticed a loose doorknob and remembered how to fix it, just like he'd watched his mother do countless times at home. His mother discovered a pile of unfolded laundry and tackled it efficiently, her hands moving with practiced grace. When Dr. Brooks returned from work that evening, she found her house tidier than ever. The floors gleamed, the windows sparkled, and even the plants looked perkier after Liam had carefully watered them. "You've been busy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But please don't feel obligated." "We want to help," Liam explained, standing straight and tall. "You're being so kind to us, and Mama always says kindness should be returned." His mother nodded, adding softly, "It helps us feel less—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Less like we're imposing." Dr. Brooks looked at them both, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're not imposing," she said firmly, "but if helping makes you feel more at home, then I'm grateful for your help." That evening, as Liam and his mother prepared dinner alongside Dr. Brooks, the kitchen felt warmer somehow. The clatter of pots and pans, the sizzle of cooking food, and the quiet conversation created a comfortable atmosphere that made the grand house feel a little more like home. As the days melted into one another, Liam and his mother fell into a gentle rhythm within Dr. Brooks' home. Each morning, Liam would wake early to help his mother with breakfast, their quiet movements in the kitchen becoming a familiar dance. The smell of coffee and toast would drift upstairs, greeting Dr. Brooks as she prepared for work. One afternoon, Liam noticed a dripping faucet in the downstairs bathroom. Without being asked, he retrieved the toolbox from the garage, just as he'd done countless times at their old apartment. His small hands worked carefully with the wrench, remembering his mother's patient instructions from years past. Dr. Brooks found him there, concentrated on his task. "Liam, you don't have to," she began, but stopped when she saw his proud smile as the drip finally ceased. "All fixed," he announced, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Mama taught me how." Meanwhile, Liam's mother transformed the house with her attention to detail. She noticed things others might miss: dusty corners, smudged windows, even a loose thread on the living room curtains that she carefully mended one evening. Her practiced hands moved with purpose, treating Dr. Brooks' home with the same care she'd always given their own. During dinner preparations, the three of them worked together in comfortable silence. Liam would wash vegetables while his mother chopped them, and Dr. Brooks learned their unspoken language of nods and gentle touches that meant, "Pass the salt" or "Need help with that?" One evening, as thunder rumbled outside, Dr. Brooks watched Liam's mother expertly repair a tear in one of her old sweaters. "You have such skilled hands," she remarked softly. Liam's mother looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "When you can't afford new things, you learn to take good care of what you have." Dr. Brooks felt her heart squeeze with understanding. She'd begun to see beyond their role as guests, noticing how Liam's eyes lit up when he solved a problem, how his mother's quiet strength showed in everything she did. The house itself seemed to respond to their presence. Rooms that had once felt formal and stiff now held warmth and life. The kitchen, especially, had become a gathering place where they shared stories over simple tasks. Dr. Brooks found herself looking forward to coming home, knowing she'd find Liam and his mother there, making her house feel more like a home than it had in years. Even small moments became precious, like when Liam discovered an old board game in the closet, and they spent an evening playing together, their laughter echoing through the usually quiet halls. Or when his mother taught Dr. Brooks her secret recipe for chicken soup, passed down from her grandmother. "You've both brought such life to this place," Dr. Brooks admitted one evening, watching them work together to hang fresh curtains in the living room. "I didn't realize how much it needed it." Liam beamed at the compliment while his mother's eyes grew soft with emotion. They had come here seeking shelter, but somehow in their dedication to helping and showing gratitude, they had created something more, a sense of belonging that touched all three of them deeply. Dr. Brooks' son, James, stopped by his mother's house more frequently now, ostensibly to check on repairs after the typhoon. Each visit, he found himself watching Liam and his mother from a distance, his brow furrowed in confusion at what he witnessed. One Saturday morning, he arrived to find Liam on his hands and knees in the garden, carefully pulling weeds and tending to his mother's storm-damaged flower beds. The boy worked methodically, treating each plant with gentle care. James stood at the window, coffee cup in hand, struck by how different this scene was from what he'd imagined. "He's been out there since sunrise," Dr. Brooks said quietly, coming to stand beside her son. "Says the flowers remind him of the ones his grandmother used to grow." James watched as Liam's mother joined her son, carrying fresh mulch. They worked together seamlessly, speaking little, but communicating through small gestures and shared smiles. Their dedication to restoring someone else's garden made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Later that day, he overheard Liam's mother refusing payment when Dr. Brooks tried to give her money for all the repair work they'd done. "You've given us shelter," she said firmly. "Let us give back what we can." The dignity in her voice made James think of all the assumptions he'd made about their motives. He remembered his pointed questions at that first dinner, the thinly veiled accusations in his tone. Now, watching them work tirelessly to help his mother, those suspicions seemed not just unfair but shameful. In the kitchen, he found Liam playing with his own daughter, the baby he'd rescued, singing kids' songs. The boy's patience with the toddler's clumsy attempts touched something deep inside him. There was no resentment in Liam's interactions with his daughter, no trace of the bitterness that James realized he'd expected to find. "You're really good with her," James said, surprising himself by speaking. Liam looked up, initially cautious at James's presence. "I like helping people," he said simply. "It makes me feel good inside." The straightforward honesty in the boy's words made James's carefully constructed prejudices crack further. He thought about how this child had carried his daughter to safety without hesitation, asking nothing in return. Now here he was, still giving, still caring, despite the suspicion and cold shoulders he'd received. Each small act of kindness he witnessed began to chip away at James's preconceptions. He saw how Liam's mother mended her old clothes with the same care she'd give expensive garments. He noticed how they kept the house cleaner than any paid help ever had, how they anticipated needs before they were voiced. These weren't people looking for handouts or trying to take advantage, as he'd initially suspected. They were people who gave more than they took, who faced adversity with grace and hard work. The realization made him deeply uncomfortable, forcing him to confront the unfairness of his initial judgment. One evening, watching them all share a meal together, James felt the last of his suspicions beginning to crumble. The warmth and genuine care they brought to his mother's home was undeniable. He found himself wondering how many other times in his life he'd been wrong, how many people he'd misjudged based on nothing but his own prejudices. One sunny afternoon, James struggled with a broken pipe under the kitchen sink, muttering under his breath as water dripped steadily onto the floor. Liam, passing by with a basket of folded laundry, noticed his frustration. "Can I help?" Liam asked quietly, setting down the basket. "My mom taught me about fixing pipes. We couldn't always afford a plumber." James hesitated, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You know about plumbing?" "Yes, sir. We learned to fix most things ourselves." Liam's voice was steady, despite James's skeptical tone. Reluctantly, James moved aside, making room for Liam to see under the sink. The boy studied the pipe carefully, then pointed to a specific spot. "The seal's broken here. We can fix it without replacing the whole thing." Working together, they began the repair. Liam's small hands could reach places James's couldn't, and he knew exactly which tools to ask for. As they worked, Liam shared stories about learning home repairs with his mother. "Once our bathroom faucet wouldn't stop dripping," Liam said, carefully tightening a connection. "Mom and I stayed up until midnight fixing it because we couldn't waste water. Our bill was already too high." James listened, struck by the matter-of-fact way Liam described their struggles. There was no self-pity in his voice, just quiet determination. "That must have been hard," James said softly, passing Liam a wrench. "Sometimes, but Mom says difficulties make you stronger if you let them." Liam paused, checking their work. "Like when I found your daughter. I was scared, but I knew I had to help." The mention of that day made James's chest tighten with shame. He watched Liam work, remembering his own suspicious questions and cold behavior. This boy, who'd saved his daughter without hesitation, who now helped fix his mother's house while asking nothing in return, had shown more character than James had. "You know, Liam," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I haven't been very fair to you." Liam's hands stilled on the pipe. He looked at James, his eyes wise beyond his years. "It's okay. People sometimes make up their minds about me before they know me. I just try to show them who I really am." The simple honesty of his words struck James deeply. Here was a child who'd faced prejudice with grace and responded with kindness. James felt a growing respect for Liam's strength of character. They finished the repair together, the pipe now fixed and dry. As they cleaned up the tools, James found himself sharing stories about his own childhood, about learning to fix things with his father. Liam listened eagerly, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest. The afternoon passed quickly as they worked side by side, the earlier tension between them dissolving with each shared story and accomplished task. James began to see Liam not as someone to be suspicious of, but as a remarkable young person who had much to teach him about courage, kindness, and looking beyond surface judgments. That evening, James sat alone in his study, staring out the window as the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. The memory of his afternoon with Liam played over and over in his mind, each replay bringing a sharper stab of shame. He watched as Liam and his mother worked together in the garden below, carefully tending to his mother's flowers that had been damaged in the storm. Their gentle dedication to restoring something that wasn't even theirs touched something deep inside him. "What kind of man judges a child?" he whispered to himself, running a hand through his hair. The weight of his previous behavior pressed heavily on his chest. He remembered the dinner, how he'd peppered Liam with questions, looking for deceit where there was only innocence, how he'd made subtle comments designed to make Liam and his mother feel less than welcome. The boy had saved his daughter, his precious Emma, without a second thought. And how had James repaid that courage? With suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Through the window, he watched Liam help his mother with a particularly stubborn root. The boy's face showed the same determination he'd displayed while fixing the pipe, the same quiet strength he'd shown at that uncomfortable dinner. Despite James's cold treatment, Liam had never responded with anger or resentment. Instead, he'd offered only kindness and help. "He's twice the person I am," James murmured, his throat tight with emotion. He thought about how Liam had shared stories of fixing things with his mother, of making do with less, of facing challenges with grace. The boy hadn't complained about their circumstances or sought pity. Instead, he'd shown resilience and dignity that put James's own behavior to shame. The sound of Liam's laughter drifted up through the window as he and his mother discovered a butterfly in the garden. The pure joy in that sound made James's eyes sting with tears. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let his prejudices cloud his judgment of such a remarkable young person? James stood up and walked to his desk, where a framed photo of Emily sat. His daughter was alive and safe because of Liam's courage and kindness. The boy had risked his own safety and comfort to help a stranger, never expecting anything in return. And even now, living under James's roof, Liam continued to give. His time, his skills, his friendship, despite how poorly James had treated him. The realization of his own biases hit James like a physical blow. He'd allowed preconceived notions and unfair judgments to blind him to Liam's true character. He'd missed seeing the strength, the kindness, and the wisdom that resided in that young heart. The shame of it made his chest ache. Looking back out the window, James watched as Liam helped his mother gather their gardening tools, treating each item with care and respect. In that simple action, James saw everything he should have seen from the beginning. A thoughtful, generous soul who made the world better through small acts of kindness. The next day, James paused in the hallway as he heard voices drifting from the kitchen. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something in the gentle tone of the conversation made him stop. "We'll rebuild, baby," Liam's mother was saying softly. "We always do. Remember when the roof leaked last winter? You helped me put up that tarp and we made it work." "I know, Mom," Liam replied, his voice carrying a maturity that made James's heart clench. "And at least we're safe here. I just wish I could do more to help." James leaned against the wall, listening as Liam's mother sighed. "You do plenty, sweetheart. More than enough. The way you keep smiling through everything, it gives me strength." "The typhoon took almost everything," Liam said quietly. "But we still have each other, and Dr. Brooks has been so kind to us." "That's right," his mother agreed. "We're blessed in our own way. There's always something to be grateful for, even when times are hard." James heard the sound of dishes being washed, the quiet domestic noise a backdrop to their conversation. "Remember what you always tell me, Mom? That it's not about what happens to us, but how we handle it." "That's my wise boy," she said, and James could hear the pride in her voice. "And look how you've handled everything. Finding that baby, being brave even when people doubted you, helping around here without being asked." "I just want to do what's right," Liam said simply. "And maybe our house is gone, but we're still standing. That's what matters, right?" James felt tears pricking at his eyes. Here was this child who had lost nearly everything, focusing on gratitude and helping others. Here was this family, facing challenges James couldn't imagine, meeting them with grace and optimism. "Sometimes," Liam continued, I think about how scared that baby must have been in the park. Being alone is the worst feeling, but now I understand we're never really alone. There's always someone willing to help, like Dr. Brooks helping us." The simple wisdom in Liam's words struck James deeply. He thought about how he had treated them, how he had let his prejudices blind him to their character. While he had been busy judging them, they had been focused on finding ways to give back, to help, to remain positive. The sound of Liam's quiet laughter drifted through the hall. "At least the typhoon can't take away our stories, right, Mom? Or our memories?" "That's right, baby, and it can't take away who we are either." James pressed a hand to his mouth, overwhelmed by the beauty of their resilience. He had been so wrong about them, so terribly wrong. While he had been looking for flaws and faults, they had been demonstrating strength and dignity he hadn't even recognized. Their quiet conversation continued in the kitchen, filled with hope and determination despite their circumstances. James stood there, humbled by their unwavering spirit, realizing that he had much to learn from this family he had so unfairly judged. That evening, as the sun painted the living room in soft orange hues, James found Liam and his mother sitting together on the couch, looking through old photos they'd managed to salvage from their damaged home. His heart pounded as he stood in the doorway, watching them share quiet smiles over memories preserved in slightly water-damaged pictures. "Excuse me," James said softly, his voice shakier than he'd expected. Could I speak with you both for a moment?" Liam and his mother looked up, surprise evident on their faces. James moved into the room, his steps hesitant as he settled into an armchair across from them. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Especially you, Liam. The way I treated you at dinner that night, and even after, it was inexcusable." Liam sat very still, his young face serious as he listened. His mother placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "When you found my daughter's baby," James continued, his voice cracking slightly, "you didn't see color or status or anything else. You just saw a child who needed help. And instead of thanking you properly, I let my prejudices cloud my judgment." Tears welled in his eyes as he looked directly at Liam. "You showed more character and courage than most adults I know. You're an extraordinary young man, Liam, and I was too blind to see it. I'm so sorry for doubting you, for making you feel unwelcome and questioned." He turned to Liam's mother, wiping at his eyes. "And I'm sorry to you too. You've raised an incredible son, and I've watched how both of you have handled everything life has thrown at you with such grace and dignity. I've been humbled by your strength." The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound the gentle ticking of the wall clock. Liam's mother squeezed her son's shoulder gently, encouraging him to speak if he wanted to. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," Liam said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "That means a lot to me." James nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. "I want you both to know that you're not just guests here anymore. You're family now, if you'll have us. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'd like the chance to try." Liam's mother reached across the space between them and placed her hand over James's trembling ones. "We all have room to grow," she said softly. "Thank you for having the courage to acknowledge your mistakes." James looked at their joined hands, a powerful symbol of the bridges being built between their families. The weight of his prejudices felt lighter now, replaced by the warmth of understanding and acceptance. Liam's eyes glistened with tears as he looked at James, seeing the genuine remorse etched across the man's face. The young boy's heart felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His mother's hand remained steady on his back, giving him the strength to speak. "I forgive you," Liam said softly, his voice clear and sincere. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." His mother nodded in agreement, squeezing James's hand gently. "We've all faced our share of prejudice," she said, her voice warm and understanding. "But it takes real courage to admit when we're wrong and try to make things right." James looked at them both with wonder, amazed by their capacity for forgiveness. "I don't deserve such kindness," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's not true," Liam replied, sitting up straighter. "My mom always says that forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about growing together and becoming better people. The wisdom in the young boy's words touched James deeply. He reached out and placed his other hand over Liam's mother's, creating a circle of connection between them. "You know," Liam's mother said thoughtfully, "maybe everything that happened, finding the baby, the storm, staying here, maybe it was meant to bring us together, to help us understand each other better." James nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he processed her words. When he finally found his voice, it was filled with determination. "I want to learn," he said. "I want to understand. And I want to be the kind of person who sees others the way Liam does, with pure kindness and courage." Liam smiled, a real, bright smile that lit up his whole face. "We can all learn from each other," he said. "That's what makes us stronger." The atmosphere in the room had transformed. Where there had once been tension and unease, there was now warmth and understanding. The three of them sat together, hands joined, feeling the powerful connection that had grown between them, a connection built on honesty, forgiveness, and the hope for a better future together. As the weeks passed, Liam and his mother finally returned to their rebuilt home. The community had come together to help repair the damage from the typhoon, with many hands making the work lighter. Their small house now stood stronger than before, its fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight. On moving day, Dr. Brooks helped them settle back in, carrying boxes and arranging furniture. Her eyes welled up with tears as she watched Liam carefully place his books on a new shelf that James had built for him. "I can't thank you enough for everything," Liam's mother said, her voice soft with emotion as she hugged Dr. Brooks. "You opened your home to us when we needed it most." Dr. Brooks squeezed her hand tight. "You've given us so much more than we could ever repay," she replied. "Your presence in our lives has taught us what real strength and forgiveness look like." The neighborhood had changed too. Mrs. Johnson from next door, who used to hurry inside whenever she saw them, now brought over a homemade casserole to welcome them back. Mr. Peterson, the retired teacher down the street, stopped by with his toolbox to help hang pictures and fix a squeaky door. "You know," Mrs. Johnson said, watching Liam help her granddaughter with her homework on the front porch, "that boy of yours has shown us all what it means to be brave and kind." Other neighbors began dropping by regularly, bringing small gifts or simply stopping to chat. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid them now waved warmly and called out greetings. "Your son's actions with Dr. Brooks's grandbaby got us all thinking," Mr. Peterson admitted one afternoon. "But it was watching how you both handled everything after, the prejudice, the storm, all of it, that really opened our eyes. You never lost your dignity or your kindness." Liam's mother noticed the change in how people treated them. Where there had once been suspicious glances, there were now friendly smiles. The community began to see them not as outsiders, but as valuable members who had enriched their neighborhood with their presence. Even the local grocery store owner, who had always watched Liam carefully when he came to buy milk for his mother, now greeted him by name and asked about his day. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw them, it was in how the whole community had grown together, learning to look past their differences and see the humanity they all shared. One afternoon, Dr. Brooks stood in her backyard, now transformed with twinkling lights and decorated tables. She had spent days planning this special gathering to honor Liam, wanting everything to be perfect. Neighbors, friends, and family members filled the space, their excited chatter floating through the warm evening air. Liam shifted nervously beside his mother, overwhelmed by all the attention. He wasn't used to being the center of so many people's focus, but Dr. Brooks's warm smile helped calm his racing heart. "Everyone," Dr. Brooks called out, gently tapping her glass. The crowd quieted, turning to face her. "We're here tonight to celebrate someone very special. A young boy who showed us what true courage and kindness look like." Her voice trembled with emotion as she continued. "Liam didn't just save my granddaughter that day in the park. He showed us all what it means to do the right thing, even when faced with suspicion and doubt. His actions started a chain of events that brought our community closer together." Dr. Brooks's son stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder. "I was wrong about you, Liam," he admitted, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "You taught me to look beyond my prejudices and see people for who they truly are." Neighbors began sharing their own stories. Mrs. Johnson spoke about how Liam helped her carry groceries during the flood. Mr. Peterson described watching Liam comfort a crying kindergartner who had fallen on the playground. "That's just who he is," Liam's mother said proudly, wiping tears from her eyes. "He's always thinking of others before himself." The community had prepared a surprise for Liam, a handmade book filled with letters and drawings from local children, thanking him for being their hero. As Dr. Brooks presented it to him, the gathered crowd broke into warm applause. "You've shown us all what real strength looks like," Dr. Brooks said, hugging Liam tight. "Not just in saving my granddaughter, but in how you handled everything that came after, with grace, forgiveness, and unwavering kindness." The celebration continued as people gathered around Liam, sharing words of appreciation and gratitude. The same community that had once viewed him with suspicion now embraced him fully, celebrating not just his heroic act, but the remarkable young person he was every single day. As summer turned to fall, the Brooks family and Liam's family settled into a comfortable routine. Every Sunday evening, they gathered around Dr. Brooks' large dining room table, sharing meals that combined both families' traditions. The aroma of home-cooked dishes filled the warm kitchen as they worked together to prepare dinner. "Mom, remember when I tried to make pancakes that time?" Liam asked one evening, helping his mother chop vegetables. "They looked more like scrambled eggs." Everyone laughed, and Dr. Brooks's son jumped in with his own story. "That's nothing compared to my first attempt at cooking. I nearly burned down the kitchen trying to boil water for pasta." These shared moments of laughter became precious to both families. Dr. Brooks especially loved watching her granddaughter toddle between Liam and his mother, completely at ease with them. The baby would reach for Liam whenever he entered the room, recognizing him as her special protector. During their meals together, they shared stories about their lives, discovering surprising connections and similarities. Liam's mother talked about her childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, while Dr. Brooks shared tales from her early days as a medical student. "I never thought I'd make it through residency," Dr. Brooks admitted one evening, passing the mashed potatoes. "But something my mother used to say kept me going. Every step forward, no matter how small, takes you closer to where you need to be." Liam's mother nodded in understanding. "That's what I tell Liam too. Sometimes the hardest things in life lead us to the best places." As they continued sharing meals and stories, the initial awkwardness that had once existed between them melted away completely. Dr. Brooks's son, who had once viewed Liam with suspicion, now treated him like a younger brother, helping him with homework and teaching him to play chess. The families created new traditions together. Thursday nights became game nights, filled with friendly competition and endless bowls of popcorn. They celebrated birthdays together, blending their different customs into new shared experiences that felt natural and right. During these gatherings, they often found themselves sharing deeper stories about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes. These conversations helped them understand each other better, strengthening their bond and creating a deep sense of trust between both families. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Brooks and Liam, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.